There is a rule of the sea that sailors have understood for centuries. When you are lost in the dark, when the fog is so thick you cannot see your own hand in front of your face, when the rocks are close and the water is pulling you toward them, you look for the light. The lighthouse light. It is the one thing standing between you and disaster. The one thing that says, someone is there, someone is watching, someone has not forgotten you out here in the dark. That light is a promise. And for hundreds of years, lighthouse keepers have been the ones making that promise. Living alone or in small pairs at the edge of the world, in towers perched on cliffsides and rocky outcroppings, doing one job and doing it without fail. Keep the light on, through storms, through illness, through loneliness that most of us will never understand, through winters that seem to last forever and nights that stretch on without end. Keep the light on. So imagine what it means when a supply boat pulls up to a lighthouse on a calm, gray morning, and everything looks normal. The light is running, the lens is turning, the foghorn is operational. Everything is exactly as it should be, except the keeper is gone. Not sick, not on shore, not sleeping below deck. Gone. And not just gone, gone in a way that makes no sense, because the logbook is open on the desk. The last entry is written in a steady hand. The beds are made. The equipment is maintained. The lamp that requires constant human attention, is trimmed and burning perfectly, as if someone had been there minutes ago. But there is no one. There has not been anyone for weeks. This is not one story. This is several. Across different oceans, different eras, different keepers. And every single one of them ends the same way. The light kept turning, and the keeper was never found. This is mysterious and documented. Let's go into the dark. Before we get into the disappearances themselves, I want to spend a little time in the world these men lived in, because I think it matters. I think if you understand what their daily life actually looked like, what they endured just to do their job, the mystery of what happened to them hits differently. Being a lighthouse keeper was not a glamorous posting. It was, by almost every account, one of the loneliest jobs a human being could have. You were stationed at the edge of the inhabited world, sometimes completely alone, sometimes with one or two other keepers, and your entire existence revolved around one responsibility. The light could not go out, not for any reason, not for any emergency, not for any personal crisis or illness or grief or fear. Ships depended on that light. Crews of dozens, sometimes hundreds of sailors, were navigating by it. If it went dark for even a few hours at the wrong moment, in the wrong conditions, ships would run aground. People would die. That weight sat on the keeper every single day. And the conditions they lived in were brutal. Many lighthouses were built in places that were deliberately remote, on rocks in the middle of the ocean, on cliffsides battered by constant wind, on coastlines so inhospitable that supply boats could only reach them every few weeks when the weather permitted. For weeks at a time, the keeper's entire world was that tower, that light, that ocean, the logbooks they kept, and many of them survive to this day, give us a window into what that life felt like. And what comes through, again and again, is not drama, not excitement. It is the grinding, relentless weight of routine. The same tasks every day, cleaning the lens, trimming the wick, winding the clockwork mechanism that kept the light rotating, recording weather conditions, recording shipping traffic, maintaining the equipment, day after day after day. In the margins of some logbooks, between the official entries, you can sometimes find small personal notes. A keeper writing about a dream he had. A keeper noting that he saw a bird land on the railing, the first living thing he'd seen in 11 days. A keeper writing, in careful measured handwriting, that he was finding it difficult to remember what his wife's voice sounded like. These were real men, living in real isolation, doing an extraordinary job under extraordinary conditions. And some of them, a few of them, vanished from their posts in circumstances that have never been explained. Let me walk you through what one of these discoveries actually looked like. A supply boat approaches the lighthouse on its regular schedule. The crew has made this run before. They know the keeper. They know the routine. Someone will be on the railing or at the door, or at minimum they'll see movement behind the glass of the lantern room. The light is running. That's the first thing they notice, and it registers as normal. Good. No problems. They pull alongside. They call out. No response. They assume the keeper is below, maybe sleeping, maybe occupied with maintenance. They tie off and they climb up. The door is unlocked. That is not unusual. There is no reason to lock a lighthouse door when you are the only person for miles in every direction. They go inside. And this is where every account of every one of these disappearances starts to sound the same. The interior is orderly, maintained, everything in its place.
No overturned furniture.
No broken equipment. No sign of a struggle or a fall or an accident of any kind. In the kitchen, food. Sometimes a meal partially prepared. Sometimes dishes washed and stacked. Signs of recent, ordinary domestic life. In the sleeping quarters, beds made. Personal items in place. Clothing hanging where clothing should hang. And then they climb the stairs to the lantern room. The light is running perfectly. And this is the detail that stops everyone who has ever studied these cases cold. Because keeping that light running is not passive. It is not something that happens on its own. The clockwork mechanism that rotates the lens has to be wound. The fuel has to be managed. The wick has to be trimmed. These are active, ongoing tasks. Someone or something had been maintaining that light, but there was no one there. The logbook in several of these cases is the most haunting piece of evidence, because the entries don't stop dramatically. There is no final frantic note, no entry that says something is wrong, no indication that the keeper felt threatened or ill or afraid. The last entry in every case is routine. Weather conditions, visibility, ship spotted, standard operational notes, written in a calm, steady hand, and then nothing, as if the keeper finished his entry, set down his pen, and simply stepped out of the world. The search efforts that followed found nothing of use. In several cases, the surrounding rocks and shoreline were examined carefully for signs of a fall or an accident. The water was watched for days. Nothing was ever recovered. Not a body, not a piece of clothing, not a single physical trace of where the keeper had gone. Just the light, still turning, still making its promise to the ships at sea, still keeping the watch that its keeper no longer could. Now, I want to be honest with you about something. The straightforward explanation for a lighthouse keeper disappearing is that they fell. These were men working alone, often in wet and windy conditions, on structures built at the edge of cliffs or on rocks surrounded by water. A slip, a wave at the wrong moment, an accident with no witness. It happens. It is tragic and it is real, and it accounts for many deaths at sea and at lighthouse stations throughout history. But here is the problem with applying that explanation to these particular cases. The maintenance. If a keeper fell into the sea in the middle of the night, the light would eventually fail. The mechanism would wind down. The fuel would run out. The wick would burn unevenly and begin to dim. Within hours, certainly within a day, the light would show signs of neglect. But in the cases I'm talking about, that didn't happen. When the supply boats arrived, sometimes weeks after the last confirmed contact, the light was not failing. It was not dimming. It was not running on fumes. It was maintained, which means one of two things. Either the keeper disappeared very recently, close enough to the supply boat's arrival that the light hadn't had time to fail, or something else was keeping it going. And investigators pushed hard on the first option. They tried to establish timelines. They interviewed anyone who had seen or communicated with the lighthouse in the weeks before the discovery. They combed through the logbook's entry by entry, looking for the point at which the keeper's routine broke down. In several cases, they couldn't find it. The logbook entries continued normally right up to a date that, based on the condition of the light and the provisions used, shouldn't have been possible if the keeper had been gone for weeks. Some investigators suggested the keeper may have falsified entries, written ahead in the log to cover a planned absence. But this theory raised more questions than it answered. Why would a keeper do that? Where would they go? And how do you explain the state of the light? There was one case, and I want to be careful here because the documentation on this specific detail is disputed, where a notation in the official investigation report described the lantern room as being unusually cold when the investigators arrived. Not the cold of a room that had been sitting empty and unheated in winter air. A different kind of cold. The kind one investigator described as feeling almost deliberate. I'm not telling you what to make of that. I'm just telling you it was written down by a man who was there. So what happened to these men? Let's go through the serious explanations first, and then I want to get to the one that I think is the most interesting. The first theory is accident, a fall or a wave. As I said, this is the most statistically common cause of death for lighthouse keepers. Freak waves, walls of water that appear without warning on otherwise calm days, have claimed many lives on exposed coastlines. A keeper steps outside for routine maintenance, a wave strikes, and he is gone before he has time to react. This theory is plausible for a single disappearance. The problem is it doesn't explain the maintenance. And it doesn't explain why, in some of these cases, investigators found no evidence of disrupted routine anywhere in the lighthouse. If a keeper was swept away mid-task, something would be out of place. Something would be unfinished. But everything was finished. The second theory is voluntary disappearance. Maybe a keeper, pushed past his limit by years of isolation, simply decided to walk away, took a boat or swam, or found some way off the rock that no one ever discovered, started a new life somewhere far from the sea. It's a romantic theory, and it's not impossible. But these were men with families, with lives they had chosen to return to between postings. And the voluntary disappearance theory doesn't explain why none of them were ever found. Not one. Not in a neighboring town, not in another country, not years later with a different name. They disappeared as completely as if they had never existed. The third theory, and this is where the documented record gets genuinely strange, is that something came to them. Not in a supernatural sense. At least not necessarily. The ocean is vast. And in the era when most of these disappearances occurred, the ocean was also deeply unknown. Ships returned from distant waters with accounts of things they had seen that didn't match anything in the natural record. Strange lights beneath the surface, shapes in the fog that didn't move like weather, sounds that had no identifiable source. Some researchers who have studied lighthouse disappearances specifically have noted that in several cases, the official logs in the weeks before the keeper vanished contain small anomalies. Weather recorded as unusual, unexplained lights noted on the water. In one case, an entry that simply reads, and I will read this exactly as it was recorded, something in the water last night, watched it until morning, did not sleep. 2 entries later, the log ends. And then there is the fourth theory, the one nobody in an official investigation ever wrote down. What if the light itself, the act of sending that beam out into the darkness night after night, year after year, was calling something in? What if whatever answered that call came not to be warned away, but to see who was sending the signal? I'm not saying I believe that. I want to be clear about that. But I've read enough of these accounts now, enough of these logbooks, enough of these investigation reports, and there is something that connects all of them that I can't quite name. A pattern that sits just below the surface of the facts. The light kept turning, in every case, without fail, and nobody has ever been able to fully explain why. I keep coming back to the logbooks, to those last normal entries, written carefully, professionally, by men who took their responsibility seriously even after months of isolation. Weather conditions, visibility, ships spotted, light maintained, and then silence. There is something about the act of keeping a log, of recording the ordinary details of your day as evidence that you were there, that you existed, that you did your job, that feels deeply human to me. These men weren't writing for posterity. They weren't writing to be remembered. They were writing because it was required, because it was part of the routine, because it was one more small way of imposing order on a world that was mostly wind and water and darkness. And then one day they stopped, not with a dramatic final entry, not with a goodbye, just stopped, and the light kept going. I find that almost unbearable to think about. That light, turning and turning in an empty tower, doing its job, keeping its promise. For days, maybe weeks, with no one there to tend it. Like it was waiting for someone to come back. No one ever did. If you've stayed with me this long, thank you. Genuinely, these stories matter to me, not just as mysteries, but as human stories. Stories about people who lived quietly and worked hard and then disappeared in ways we still cannot explain. I think they deserve to be talked about. Drop your theory in the comments. I want to know what you think happened in that lantern room. What made those last log entries? What kept that light turning? And if this is the kind of storytelling you want every week, subscribe. Hit the bell. Because next week we go somewhere even darker. Until then, if you're near the coast tonight, don't look at the water too long.